Oh, some lovely person in the UK sent me this picture after I found it on the internet. So this is Ralph Josselin's church. And tonight we are examining his diary. I hope some of you at least read part of the diary because it's really worth it. It's a beautiful thing. He was a 17th century Puritan minister in the village of Earls Colne, where this church is in Essex, which is northeast of London, about 65 miles. And he was minister in this church from 1641, when he moved there with his wife, to his death in 1683. So as you'll see, on the surface anyway, he was not particularly remarkable. His portrait is not in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and they have a collection of over 200,000 portraits. He does not appear there. He is not Samuel Pepys, who was at the center of absolutely everything. He did not talk about his sex life, as those of you who have read Pepys know. He talked a lot about that. He does not reveal state secrets. He's actually just a regular person in Middle England in a small village. And so why are we reading his diary? I mean, so he's not exceptional. He's not a Pepys. Why do we read him? Let me just move on. Sorry. So I would say that there are a few reasons to read Jocelyn and to read diaries in general. And one is because of the nature of diaries, that they, I just came across this quote in an article about something else. It doesn't relate directly, but let's sort of read it together, because it to me, it sums up like why diaries are such a gift. The historian is thrown back on the glimpses of daily life found in the chance remark, in the letter, in the poem, in the play, in the diary. In short, wherever we are allowed a view of the human dimension of the times. So this idea of being allowed into someone's life, it is a gift. We are kind of invited into their life in this very privileged way. And what we get through that is an understanding of the thinking of the person, their personality, who they are, their mental and emotional world. And here we have Jocelyn, who suffers from a lot of health problems. We hear about his care for his parishioners, why he's worried about money, he's worried about his wife. He's a very human character. And then I'd say, here we are. People often say the past is another country. Here we are invited into the life of somebody who lived over 350 years ago. So what then does this reveal about somebody of the past? How different is he from us today? What comes through in terms of his outlook on the world? Another reason to read his diary is because it's a rare diary, and there are not even 400 diaries from the 17th century up to the 17th century that survive, and most of them are just many are just a few pieces of paper. So there are very few diaries that give a kind of 360 degree view of life. So Jocelyn wasn't just a minister. He was a farmer, a landlord, a father, a school teacher, a book collector, a colleague, a patient to physicians. He visited the sick. He was an army chaplain in the parliamentary army. He did, and he paints a picture of that entire life, which is very unusual. Pepys does that, but really, and maybe Robert Hooke, but no one else really. So it's a treasure trove for social historians. And people have written a lot about Jocelyn. There is a long chapter about health. There are people have written about what he says about the weather. There's just a whole host of things that people look at. And because it's rare to find out how people really lived. We can get the big events of history, but how people felt and thought and lived their intimate lives that's another matter. That's where you are allowed the view in the inside. And finally, I think that this diary, certainly compared to Pepys and Robert Hooke and the others, it's a testament to his faith. It's almost an act of faith. I don't know if any of you who read extracts from the diary got this feeling, but John Morrison the colleague on the partnership pointed out to me that there's a great intimacy that Jocelyn feels with God. And it strikes me that the practice of writing on a regular basis and giving his thanks to God and his providentialism is a kind of practice of his faith. It is almost a kind of prayer on paper. So those are the reasons I think why we want to look at Jocelyn's diary. And of course, there is the question of why do people keep diaries? You know, so this is a picture of one of the pages from Samuel Pepys' diary. So we know that because you can't read it, he made up this shorthand. Pepys made up this shorthand, and it took years for people to decipher. And he wrote this diary and kept it very, very private, which is one reason it's such a great diary to read. And it just like, he reveals all. But so we know that he did. But then we have the other extreme. Frank might not agree, but I think that John Winthrop wrote his journal in large part for posterity. And I think the editor of Winthrop's journal, you know, comments that somehow John Winthrop always turns out to be the hero of his story. So he's kind of portraying himself in, like, you know, in how will history view him? And I think that Jocelyn is sort of in between. He starts out writing for posterity, and his kind of that summary at the beginning of the diary where he gives that kind of from birth to his young adulthood when he's looking for jobs, and it's a kind of a rags to riches Dickensian story where he has to sell his clothes in order to pay to transport to his first jobs and so forth. And then it becomes more of a regular diary where he's writing for himself. And by the end of the diary, which we're not looking at, but would be great someday, he is really writing about, it's the inner man comes out. He's writing about his terrible pain. He has doubts about his faith. He is worried about his children. You feel he's going to more and more inwards as you go through the diary. And actually, he tells us why he writes the diary in a way in the title that he gives it. So he calls it, at the top of the first page, a thankful observation of divine providence and goodness towards me, and a summary view of my life by me, Ralph Josselin. So I think you can divide this into two. We can break it down and say, the first part is a thankful observation of divine providence, which is this act of faith and which frames the entire diary, almost every entry, but the whole diary as a whole, I think. This is my view anyway. We'll hear what Frank has to say about this. And the summary view of my life, which is much more about, you know, what happened, when, where, who, why, the events of the world. And so, so what else to say about this? So here he is. This is the only portrait of him that exists. You can see he is not handsome. He is not prepossessing. He is not wearing a wig. He doesn't really have any elaborate collar, which is appropriate. He's a minister. He's looking a little worried, and which kind of defines a lot of the anxiety that runs through his diary, but he's thoughtful. And you know, I find it kind of endearing. One more thing I would say about the diary, which is it's almost, to me, a kind of dialogue with God. And because he's constantly thanking God for his mercies in regard to specific things, saving his daughter from ill health or himself from a fall, but also just in general, he thanks him for all the good things. So it's a kind of a dialogue and working out his relationship to God and his faith. But equally, he's recording, you know, global events and how it affects him. So let's go to a little context. This is the county of Essex. And Earls Colne, you can't see because it's actually a beautiful map, but this is Earls Colne right here at the top. So you can see London down here along the Thames, all bristling with buildings and church spires. That's about 65 miles. It is about 1,000 people. And Earls Colne has about 1,000 people when he moves there with his wife. And the social structure is like almost every English village. So there are two gentry families, both parliamentarian and Puritan, the Harlackendens and the Honeywoods. And then and they become his patrons. The Harlackendens pay for part of his salary. They give him medical advice. They all worship together at the priory, which is the Harlackenden family home. They become very close. And then they're the kind of middle-ranking families, and Jocelyn becomes one of them, maybe the top, in wealth, among the top dozen families in the village. That takes quite a lot of time. He's poor for a very long time, and then he moves in to the upper echelons a little more. And then there are farmers, weavers, carpenters, and even below that there are farm laborers or landless laborers and that sort of thing, or poor weavers. So today, I'm sure many of you have been to London and you know that Essex, I'm sorry to say, is kind of, in the view of Londoners anyway, a kind of déclassé cousin. But in those days, Essex was praised for its beauty and for its wealth. It was a very wealthy county. It had agriculture and it had a clothing industry. So you had lots of weavers, clothiers, traders along the ports, along the coast there on the East Coast, fulling mills along the rivers. It was vibrant. By the time that we entered the story, though, it has already suffered from quite a lot of economic depression. So there's unemployment, people are really in trouble, harvests have failed, so there's a lot of hunger, and there is tremendous pressure for more money to be paid to Charles I, the monarch, who is putting pressure on the gentry, but that exacts pressure all the way down the social scale. So it's a county in pain and resisting very imperious demands from the king. So have a look at this slide. It is from an etching by Wenceslas Huller, and it was published in London in 1642. So the heading here is, as you can read, "The world is ruled and governed by opinion." And this, to me, kind of sums up the feeling of the world, of, the English world, well, Scotland too, the sort of sense of disorder, tumult, disagreement, disputation, different points of view taking place are spilling over in the early 1640s. So the state of the nation when Jocelyn becomes Earls Colne's minister is this sense of disputation and we can relate to this today, a lot of division in society. So that's how we enter it. But if you look at the list at the top of the slide, these are the major events that take place during Jocelyn's lifetime, which is another reason to read him, because almost every major event of the 17th century, barring the Glorious Revolution, and he does get the run up to that, takes place during his lifetime, and he registers it in his diary. By Archbishop Laud, we have Charles I, becoming more and more authoritarian. That's to use a word we would use today, not then. We have, and the lead up to Civil War, we have an actual civil war, two civil wars, but run over a long period of time, most of the 1640s. We then have the execution of Charles I, Cromwell's Commonwealth, then the Restoration in 1660, then the Plague in 1665-66, and then the Great Fire. And he mentions all this, he lives through it, and he gives us his view of what is happening. But this is just to kind of situate us in the middle of kind of what is happening around the nation. So I guess I had two questions. I mean, there are many questions you can have about Jocelyn's diary, but I had two. And one was, he's a very ordinary person, moderate Puritan. How did he respond to these tumultuous events? And I don't want to say this is the most tumultuous century ever in any country ever, because, it's not Syria. It's, there are many more. But this comes close to being about as tumultuous as you can get. And it's still, the repercussions face us today. We're still debating, should there be a republic, or should there still be a monarch, or should there be an established church? These issues were debated and fought over in the 17th century, and he lives through it. So what I wanted to know was, how was this a test of his faith, and how much courage did that require for him as a small town minister, away from London, away from the center of the action? How does he respond? My other question had to do with his obsession with health and illness. We'll come to that in a little while. So there is no doubt that Jocelyn was a Puritan, a moderate Puritan. So when he's a young man, he questions the superstitions of the Anglican Church. When he's ordained by the bishop, he refuses to bow to the altar, which is a Puritan, strong Puritan feeling about that. Early on in his ministry in Earls Colne, the Parliament passes an ordinance telling people to take down images and stained glass in the church, and he does that. So no idolatry, nothing interceding between you and God. No one stands between you, as they would say would happen in Catholicism, that the priest stands between you and God, and you're not having anyone stand between you two. And that's one reason you can't have stained glass. You have to have pure, clear glass. He preaches against the Book of Common Prayer, and he gathers the godly together to monthly discussions in people's homes, to look at scripture, to examine its meaning, and how it is relevant to each individual. He writes about these gatherings. This is a photograph of the Geneva Bible, which was published before King James Version and overlapped with it. And so we don't know what Bible Jocelyn used. He could have used King James, which was 1611. He could have used the Geneva Bible very well. But one thing that's interesting here is that it was a Calvinist translation, and with lots of commentary and so forth, and pretty anti-Catholic. But it was also meant to be used by individuals, which is very different from the King James Version. So you note here that it talks about the translation. This is a humanist idea. It talks about the translation and going back to the original sources, but also talks about how it would be for an ordinary reader, how you annotate. It has annotations for the hard places to read. And it also will explain the things of great importance for the reader. Now that's a big shift in the reading of the Bible. This is saying you, the reader, are the most important person here, and your relationship to scripture. So that really is probably, we don't know with certainty, but that is probably what Jocelyn is getting at with these meetings of the godly in homes to look at to read scripture and on a sort of a monthly basis, to gather people together. So, the other thing to say about the Bible is it's little. It's published, it's in octavo, it's published, it's handheld, so people can carry it around when they go to meetings in different places and gather in different places. That's also very different.
And that's very different than the size of his diary. So yes, looking forward to, there's bits from his diary.
I'll show you the diary. The diary is huge. The diary is large. Okay. Are you saying I need to speed up?
I was slightly.
Okay, sorry. I will try to speed up. Sorry about this. So all the things I've mentioned are sound really minor and not a big deal today, but they were then. And this is just I'll be really quick from now on. This is a quote from Thomas Shepard, who ended up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who was coincidentally a minister in Earls Colne before Shepard, not immediately before, but he preceded him. And he had an encounter with Archbishop Laud. And his recollection of that encounter in his memoirs was he looked as though blood would gush out of his face, that is, out of Laud's face, saying, I charge you that you neither preach, marry, bury, or exercise any ministerial function, for if you do, and I hear of it, I will be on your back wherever you go, and so everlastingly disenable you, which to me sounds rather ominous. So I should probably skip this then if we're...
Well, just tell us what it is very briefly.
Okay, so this is a portrayal of this is a contemporary picture, obviously, but these are the things that Puritans objected to. So altar rails, stained glass, you can see the altar rails here, they would have been larger and more elaborate, but all over Essex at this time, people were tearing down altar rails and burning them. There is an example of what I wanted to give you was a quote from somebody who heard Jocelyn preach and then went to his church in the afternoon, took out the Book of Common Prayer, and the next day, and threw it in the pond. And then the next day he went back, took it out of the pond, tore it up, burnt part of it, and put part of it in his pocket, and then was taken to court. But that shows you the kind of popular level of Puritanism and how Jocelyn was part of that. In the summer of 1642, all this begins to, turn into war. Puritanism is a large part of that, although the war is really about constitutional matters, but you can see that there's an inseparability between religion and politics. So he writes in his diary, times became fearful. We began to raise private arms. I found a musket, and the king was beginning to raise an army. Parliament did the like. So both sides are arming themselves. Then he goes on, he starts to finance the parliamentary army by selling his jewelry and raising funds locally. He writes again, the drums now also begin to beat up, and he endeavored to get others to go forth. So he's actually encouraging parishioners, people in the village, to sign up for the militias and to pay money on behalf of the parliamentary forces. He is definitely crossing, we would say, this is crossing the line between politics and between religion and politics. He sees it as one. Here, this is a really quick, I'll be quick. This is just to say that for the most part, Essex did not get touched by war. But on one of the most notable instances of atrocity during the war took place about 10 miles from his home. The Royalist army marched through his village, Earls Colne, raided his house, plundered his house, took most of his goods, and then proceeded on to the town of Colchester, which you see in the middle here. And they were placed under siege by the parliamentary army, which it went on for about 11 weeks, and it was written up, as you can see, because it was seen as an atrocity on both sides. He wrote that no part of Essex gave them so much opposition as we did, that is to the royalist forces. This is a picture of Charles I being tried. Later, of course, he's executed. Jocelyn takes a very laconic view of this. He writes in his diary, heard KC was executed, which is, for a major event, this is not much of a notice, but he later says he regrets this, he weeps, he's worried that this will bring down the wrath of God. And he notes, but quite briefly, other political developments, the abolition of the monarchy, the institution of a republic. Where he becomes, and Roxanne, I'm sorry, I'll probably have to cut this short, but where he becomes anxious again is after the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II. So the Act of Uniformity, which came in 1662, reimposed a huge amount of Anglican control. It was centralized. Worship was prescribed centrally. All the sacraments had to follow a certain protocol. 2,000 ministers, Puritan ministers, were forced out of post, and he is desperate. There is an anxiety that runs through almost a decade of his entries. And he writes, now I am left alone of the nonconformists. So I'm really skipping through that. I'm going to move on to another topic. If we have time, you can stop me if you want to, Roxanne.
We can return to it in the question. So people, keep an eye out, and those of you who did have a chance to read this fascinating diary, chime in with questions and comments later about, was Jocelyn a hypochondriac or not?
Yeah. Do you want to skip this section?
Yep, and then you can go on to the next section.
The plague?
Yes.
Okay. Or you mean here?
Or whatever.
Oh, well. Okay, I want to do this really quickly.
Yep.
Okay, so my question was he a hypochondriac? Because if you read the diary, you'll see it's wall-to-wall fear about health. And then I began to think, and he's obsessed. Then I began to think, well, maybe this is a realistic picture. So these figures are obviously estimates. They're from reputable sources, but the general gist of it is everyone is ill almost all the time. They're either chronically ill or they have acute illnesses. They have no way of knowing why. They think they know because there's a medical system based on Galen, a 2nd century physician who tells you that is all based on humoral medicine and all you have to do is let blood or take some purgatives, but they really have no way of knowing. He manages by using prayer, a lot of prayer. When friends have to have surgery, they are cut for the stone, he prays with other people. He uses home remedies like the violet cake. He receives medical care from friends. And when he's wealthier, he goes to a physician. But basically, you are on your own in the 17th century when it comes to health, especially in the countryside. Then I'll be quick with the plague because it's pretty, people know this story. The plague strikes in 1665. He collects the bills of mortality, a picture of which you see here. He begins to track the plague. So first he tracks it week by week. If you read the second excerpt that we sent you, you'll see week by week, he's starting to track what happens. This number of people fall down and die in the streets, a prayer, Lord, spare thy people. Then he begins to track it in the county of Essex, what he calls our country. These are all, I've circled all the villages that he mentions. Colchester especially was very hard hit. John Morrison totaled all the numbers, and it was well over 1,000 people who died of the plague. In Colchester, that's over 1/10 of the population. So one last thing, then I will stop. His diary entries about the plague are kind of practical. They're really about just increasingly, as he goes through the 1.5 years of plague, documenting the numbers. Is it abating? Is it increasing? And where? He doesn't show a lot of emotion, but he is a person of a lot of emotion who feels grief, who has empathy, who has a lot of compassion. And you can see this in a sermon that he gave in 1651, where he says to the husband in the sermon, he's saying to the husband of the woman, Smithy Harlackenden, who dies, "Oh, your wives, your husbands, whose departing you so much lament, are but stepped aside into their retiring rooms to take a little rest. When they wake, they shall return again." But then he acknowledges people's grief. But you eye your loss, you eye your miss and want of them. "Oh, when I return home, oh, my child that met me is dead. My wife that came forth to welcome me with joy is gone forever." So he's recognizing people's grief and sorrow. And then he returns again to his role as the Puritan minister. "Did not God make thy wife and thy daughter?" So that they're going home to God, and you should be reassured. Even though you feel grief, it's going to be okay. So just to sum up really quickly, we've looked at a little bit about Jocelyn and the kind of challenges of his age, the big events. We didn't thoroughly, but we kind of looked at whether he was a hypochondriac or was he typical of the 17th century. And then I have a final question for all of you, which is really, what kind of man was he? We have a quote from Christopher Hill, which says he's a querulous and grasping clergyman. We have a quote from his editor saying he wasn't really lovable, but he commanded respect. And we have a quote from an American historian who says he's a keen observer of politics. So what do you all think?
Lovely, Sarah. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, sorry for running over.
No, you actually ended just on time.
Okay.
With that. So if you stop sharing the screen.
Do you want to see the last, okay.
We'll show that at the end of the,
yeah.
So thank you so very much, Sarah. Yeah, Ralph Josselin is a human being. When I was reading the diary, I was struck at the beginning part that I recognized his fears when he had just graduated from Cambridge, from university, and had no idea if he had a job or whatever. His delight in having children, his fears about his daughter, who seems to be totally wild child, who was always falling. His fears, his calling upon God. So just a fascinating diary. Let's turn to Dr. Francis Jay Bremmer. I will give him his formal name and title. Frank, there I go back to Frank. Frank, as I mentioned, is Professor Emeritus from Millersville University in Pennsylvania. And he's had visiting appointments in England and at Trinity College in Dublin, published over a dozen books on Puritanism in the 17th century Atlantic world. That's the world, 17th century England especially, and 17th century New England, that joined by the Atlantic world. His most recent book is One Small Candle, which is a story of the Plymouth Puritans and the beginning of English New England with that. Frank, what's your take on Ralph Josselin? Was he a typical Puritan? Is he a typical preacher? What's your take on him and his life and his diary?
Well, first of all, I should say I'm very pleased to be here. And actually, one of the benefits of Zoom is that I can see some people that are friends that I know and that I haven't seen in a long time. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Your question, Roxanne, is a difficult one, but I'm going to try and approach it by making a couple of points. One is about religion in Ralph Josselin's world. This is a world in which the boundary between the spiritual and the material, the natural and the supernatural, just did not exist. It was a world in which people might feel the direct inspiration of God's Spirit, and day-to-day events were seen as a reflection of God's will. But one could also experience the presence of the devil, and men and women were believed capable of enlisting the power of the devil to achieve their ambitions. So some, including Jocelyn, came to believe that they could make contact with angels and devils and so forth. And they also believed, and not all Puritans or all people of faith did, that the two spheres would soon be merged with the advent of the millennium. And Jocelyn was different from a lot of Puritans in that respect. So that's the one thing I want to say. Contrary to our tendency to separate the supernatural and the natural, these are people who saw them totally intertwined. The other point goes to your question about, was Jocelyn a Puritan? Puritanism, as I've tried to stress in a lot of my works, was not a monolithic system, but a movement with many varieties along a spectrum where some people would move back and forth. There were many types of Puritans, and some of them changed their position on that spectrum over time due to different circumstances. At one extreme, Jocelyn certainly is not here, were individuals who refused any compromise with what they saw as God's dictates on belief and worship. These are people who separated from the national church and refused to engage with any who still worshiped in the Church of England. And these were the separatists, and I'll mention something about some of them in a moment. But at the other extreme and this is where I think you find Jocelyn, were individuals who saw many of the demands of bishops and monarchs as things that were ultimately indifferent. Adiaphora was the term they used. And these individuals, particularly the clergy, were willing to compromise on some of the demands of the bishops if that was the price they needed to pay in order to continue to be present for their flocks.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of people in the clergy who, at the time of the Great Migration, when Shepard and Hooker and Cotton and others left England and went to New England in order to follow their conscience and not go too far in compromising, there were many of their fellow clergy in England who condemned them for having abandoned their congregations in pursuit of their own spiritual purity. To add a dimension to this, as I alluded to before, we also have to understand that circumstances could lead men and women to reconsider their stance. Some of those who compromised for a long time, like John Cotton and Thomas Hooker, found it impossible to compromise any longer when the demands on them were greater, when they were forced to or required to perform ceremonies that they thought were against God's will. But a lot of people moved along this spectrum in various ways. John Robinson and those whom we call the Pilgrims believed that as they looked through a glass darkly to try and understand God's will, further light could be obtained. When they left screwy England, they were extreme separatists. When they embarked on the Mayflower, a little more than a decade later, they were moderate Congregationalists who were willing to engage with godly believers who still considered themselves members of the Church of England. Now, Jocelyn's career illustrates this aspect of Puritanism. A reformer who compromised with some episcopal demands prior to the English Puritan Revolution, including using the prayer book. He embraced further reforms when the opportunity presented itself, such as destroying stained glass windows. But then after the Restoration, when he was put in a situation of, again, having to conform, he did revert to what was his original position, using the prayer book and so forth, in order to hold on to his living. The last thing I want to say before we sort of open things up more to questions, I want to focus on one of the things that Sarah alluded to, and that is the godly societies. One of the characteristics of Puritanism, even within the established church, was the formation of godly societies, conventicles or conferences of believers, men and women, who came together regularly in a private house, usually, to pray, sing psalms, and share their religious beliefs and questions. Jocelyn mentions the society in Earls Colne frequently in his diary. And there were many others in the region. In Wethersfield, in Essex, Richard Rogers had formed such a group and advocated others do so in his 7 treatises. John Winthrop was part of such a group in the Groton, Boxford area before he emigrated to the New World. There was a similar group presided over by John Cotton in Boston, Lincolnshire. And of course, it was a society of this sort of believers coming together to explore their faith that Anne Hutchinson hosted in Boston, Massachusetts. So, you know, this willingness to meet with others and share one's faith experience, whether you were a clergyman or a layman, was, I think, a very important and distinctive part of Puritanism. And so I'll sort of end it there, and we can throw it open to questions and any aspects of Puritanism or this, feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, so questions from folks and thoughts. Lori's just posted a really interesting comment in the chat that Frank's article reminds us that the English Puritans were going through a lot of psychic distress. Health was part of that, but there was religious persecution, political turmoil, civil war, plague, COVID of the era, rebellions of the era, January 6th of the era, attacking the leaders of the country. Lori, do you have any thoughts? I'm curious. As I was reading Jocelyn's diary, I got wondering, is this in some way a spiritual diary? He's constantly talking to God, calling upon God, thanking God, worrying about God. How does his diary compare to some of the spiritual diaries of the period, the ones that are recognized as spiritual diaries?
I loved in the introduction that it starts the diary that it said most previous editions just cut all those out. Right. All those times he said, "Oh, thanks." Yeah. And it does start to look a little bit rote, but that's one of the things I love about it, and I love about Ralph Josselin. Mm-hmm. What is he grateful for? That I have my wife and my babes around me, and that we're all healthy. Mm-hmm. It's so simple. It's so, it has such integrity. He's not shooting for the stars. He doesn't want, big things. He is just grateful to God for his everyday blessings. And I love that about Ralph Josselin. It's not like the spiritual autobiographies that I have read, in that it's not, dedicated to his spiritual seeking. It's really different from something Thomas Shepard would write, where he's just detailing, like, here's where I succeeded, here's where I failed. I felt distant from God, I felt close. Ralph, supports my thesis that the English Puritans, and he was a moderate, just didn't have as much of the drive to really do soul searching, seeking all the time. He feels that when good things happen to him, and when his daughter is saved from yet another, accident with a horse, that's just proof that God is giving him that quiet, everyday family life that he's so grateful for. So it is very spiritual, but it's not like the diaries of seeking that I'm used to looking at.
Thank you very much for enlightening me on that.
Can I just comment on that? To me, it's a kind of practice of the faith. It's part of his almost daily practice. Everything has to do with thanking God for his mercy, thanking for his health, thanking for all the various things. And it's kind of, and the diary of Lady Margaret Hobie that we were discussing earlier, Frank, is similar in that this is part of her daily practice. And as I said, I think it's a kind of a dialogue with God too, as he moves through the diary, has a kind of crisis.
Frank, do you have a comment on that? And then I'll go to Mary Ferguson in just a moment. Mary.
Yeah. A couple of things. One is that I think that in some of the aspects that Lori spoke of are actually very similar to what we often call a spiritual diary that John Winthrop kept before he came to America. And I know Sarah talked about Winthrop's journal as being for posterity, and that's the journal that he starts in 1630. And I think, yes, you can say that's written for posterity. But prior to that, he kept a spiritual diary, and a lot of it focused on his family and his own spiritual progress. And he would write about things such as one of his sons was practicing archery and almost killed one of his other sons, but God stepped in to present this. Or a spider was found in a bowl of porridge, and this was providential. And this goes to what I was saying earlier, that for these people, what happens in their everyday lives has a spiritual dimension to it. There's a supernatural dimension. There's an intervention of that sort. So I think that's sort of important. I'd also, in terms of, I know Sarah raised the question in other diaries, and Pepys is an obvious example. One that, if you're interested in Jocelyn's diary, another diarist of the period, Puritan, that you might want to look at is Nehemiah Wallington.
True. Yes.
Wallington. Mm-hmm. Wallington actually kept 50 separate notebooks of diary, of which only 10 survive. But Paul Seaver wrote a wonderful book called Wallington's World, in which he captured much of this. And while in Wallington, you will find, as Sarah probably knows, that, you know, some of the sexual yearnings and the self-flagellation for ways in which he was going astray and so forth. So I think that would be of interest to many of you, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Ferguson, you've had your hand up. Apologies for not getting to you earlier. Why don't you unmute yourself if you've got a question, and we'd love to hear what you're thinking, or if you've got a question, thoughts, comments.
I really just have a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. I was just thinking about how I've kept a diary myself for many years, starting in the 1960s, continuing to this day. And I'm not a religious person, but I consider myself a spiritual person. And my diary really is entirely personal and as a way to kind of help myself, you know, dealing with a very chaotic world. But I think it's not that much different from the way he wrote his diary. It's just a different world and a different time. So that was just a comment I wanted to make, because so many of us keep journals and diaries.
That's a really super. I don't keep a diary, and it hadn't occurred to me that angle. Of course, people do it today, and that's a super similarity. Yes. And it allows you a way of processing and then maybe in some ways controlling your life, or putting your life into a little bit of more under your control. Sarah, I see that Fred Meyer, who's a member of the partnership, has asked a question in the chat.
I'm answering.
Pointed out that Thomas Shepard came from the same area as Ralph Josselin did. Did they know each other?
No, I don't believe so. At least it's never mentioned. It's not mentioned in Jocelyn's biography, or as far as I can tell, in the diary. But it's not surprise. I mean, it's a coincidence that they both were ministers in this one tiny village. But Essex had, more than 1,000 Puritan ministers. I have the figures somewhere, but many, many, many people. It was a real heartland of Puritanism, along with Suffolk and parts of London. And so, no, it's not surprising.
Yeah. If I could jump in there, I mean, and Shepard has already gone to New England at the time when Jocelyn goes into there, but they do have common linkage in that the Harlakenden family plays a very large role in both their lives, and Laurie would probably be able to speak more to Shepard and the Harlakendens and their help for him.
Could I just say that? So I think that Shepard did convert, might be the wrong word, but did persuade the Harlakendens or members of the Harlakenden family to become more Puritan, follow Puritanism. And so that makes a big difference in Jocelyn's life several ministers later. But by the time Jocelyn is there, Shepard had to go, after that encounter with Laud, Shepard had to go on the run for 2 years and go into hiding effectively. Mm-hmm. And then he went to New England. And then later, Jocelyn moves to Earls Colne. Sorry.
He did not they were like this.
They did not ever. Laurie, you probably have more to say.
Oh, no, that's right. I was wondering as I read, I didn't take the time to look it up. If Shepard left for New England in 1635, I wonder how long that seat was vacant before Jocelyn took it over. I'm surprised. I'm a little tiny bit surprised Jocelyn doesn't mention that, Shepard, who I think he would have been someone Jocelyn admired, because Jocelyn also liked the Harlakenden family and Shepard was close to them. Maybe in some place he mentions them. Maybe it just wasn't in our excerpt.
It being a really thick diary. Fred was also wondering, and I'm intrigued with this question, is Ralph Josselin, our diarist, related to John Jocelyn, who was a traveling naturalist who wrote a super account of basically early colonial, I want to say Eastern North America? Anybody know? And Sarah just actually said that she doesn't, in the chat, that she doesn't think that John Jocelyn is related to Frank Jocelyn. You're right, it is different spellings, but then spelling, as we've seen in Frank Jocelyn's diary, there is no standardized spelling. system with that. So Shakespeare, if Shakespeare couldn't spell his name the same way multiple times, then I'm willing to give the Jocelyn family a pass on that, but probably not related. Other questions, thoughts, comments? What kind of man was Jocelyn? Frank.
I'm not going to answer that one, but
Okay.
But I do want to make a point, and it's something that for all those who are historians among us, aspiring historians, people interested in the past. One of the things that I was fascinated with at one point was that Alan McFarlane wrote a biography. I don't have a dust jacket on it, but The Family Life of Ralph Josselin, and his essay in historical anthropology. And interestingly, Alan McFarlane was not an historian. He was a social anthropologist. And he wrote this book based on what, as he tells us in the introduction to the diary, if you read it, was what was claimed to be a complete transcript of the diary. But it was a transcript in which the person who had compiled it left out a very large portion of things that the transcriber considered to be nonsense. And yet, McFarlane, who granted was not an historian, but was a good scholar, accepted this at face value. And one of the things that we find is that we have to be careful of relying on published editions of older manuscripts as being complete. And very often they are excerpts. Margot Todd, at one point, she was down at our university and she was talking, and she mentioned about how at one point there was a published diary of Samuel Ward, who was a Cambridge Don of the period. And it was a nice, concise diary. And when she wanted to check something and she went to the manuscript, she found that what was published as his diary was only 1/10 of the entire work. And, you know, I found as well, I mean, there are Winthrop papers that are not in the published editions, and which so no one looks at, because even scholars will look at the published edition of something on the assumption that, well, the editor did their job and this is everything that there is. So it's sort of, you know, in a way, the Jocelyn diary is a cautionary tale that while they very useful, published editions of older works are not necessarily accurate. And Laurie, I would add, you know, in a wonderful work of her own, which is in a stack here, but I can't pull it out, you know, has discovered the same thing with some of Thomas Shepard's narratives of religious experience.
Yes, that's a really good point. I actually, anthropology is my background, not is that McFarlane right there by any chance?
I have McFarlane.
I'm intrigued by that because I do historical anthropology and didn't know others anthropologists actually did it. There we go. I'm gonna have to go find the book with that. But my own thesis, PhD thesis, I started working with 1913 set of Scottish stuff and discovered that not only was it abridged, but he silently left out all sorts of legal witnesses, and it totally blew my ability to do what I originally planned to do with the thesis. With that. David, you've had your hand up for a bit. Yes, do unmute yourself. What's your thoughts and comments and questions?
Yeah, I was most interested in the parts where he discusses accidents that have happened. And one of the reasons that it interests me is I feel like accidents often happen during things that you do routinely, and it gives us a really interesting idea of the daily life. As you sort of read through it. And it seems like he began the diary proper after a sort of trio of really interesting accidents in August of 1644. One where he's working on a floor and a saw falls and almost hits him in the face. And then his daughter Mary, who's about 2 or 3, falls out of a parlor window onto a bench. And I wonder, it's just interesting that, so it gives us this idea that this child would be in the parlor, and why I don't know, but
or unsupervised potentially too.
Yeah, and then there's what's the other one that comes? They were pulling down a tree, and almost he and his wife together were pulling down a tree. And so I just think it's interesting that it gives us an idea of some of the labor and also even where people would have been spending their time, that a toddler would be in the parlor, perhaps unsupervised.
And there was another bit where he's writing that the younger son, I think it was Thomas, who Mary was maybe 3 or 4 at that point, Thomas is wandering towards the fire, and Mary holds him back from the fire essentially until adults can rush in. And worldwide, people dying, babies and children falling into fires and dying is still a major problem in many countries with that. So you're right, the accidents. Yeah.
I mean, I think what struck me was how precarious life is. Not only do they have multiple accidents, but then you don't know what the consequences could be. Like, would it be a concussion? Would it be fatal? You just the answer. It might be nothing. A cold might be nothing, or it could turn into pneumonia, or what we would call pneumonia. So the whole thing. And his constant concern over accidents, particularly, but also his gratitude when an accident does not happen. So he thanks God when he walks past a wall and a brick falls, or walks past a building and a brick falls and doesn't hit him. So he's even grateful for the accidents that do not happen. I just think that the life is so uncertain. Through his lifetime, Jocelyn experienced the deaths of 30 relatives. That's a lot of people, starting in infancy and going all the way through to the end of his life. That is a lot of family to lose.
His
I
mother.
recently read the book of Marjorie Kemp, which is a very much earlier source.
Mm-hmm.
And near the end of her life, her husband slipped walking down the stairs one morning, fell on his head, and then was in a debilitated state for the rest of his life. And she writes about caring for him. So just thinking about that as a possible consequence as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the connections to today. I have a close advocacy friend, Marianne Hardenberg from Boston. She was at her place in the Cape, slipped and fell down the stairs, and has been in a coma ever since.
Oh.
Just so thereby except for the grace of God, go we. Folks thinking on what we consider sort of commonplace risks that we hardly think of them as risks. Car accidents, one of the leading causes of death today. Horse accidents, falling off your horse, getting kicked by your horse. This is in Jocelyn's diaries a lot. Were one of the common ways of getting injured then. Oops.
I remember that he says at some point that he got his face scratched. And even that, so many people, even as recent as the early 20th century, infected, cut, or scratch. So it didn't even have to be something dramatic like a fall, just getting a scratch and having to worry that it could turn into something more.
Well, they weren't capable. There's no germ theory. Therefore, you don't need to wash your hands. Therefore, you can get infected. And Jocelyn suffered severely later from an ulcer on his leg and an infected navel. And this went on for years. And he was in chronic, severe pain. And he tried all sorts of remedies. At one point, he had the money to go to a physician for his leg. The huge ulcer, his leg turned black. Things really were going wrong. He had the money by the end of his life, to go to a physician, but nothing happened. And then he turned to using tobacco leaves, which was a remedy suggested by Nicholas Culpeper, who was a famous writer of popular remedies. And that didn't work. So he took to kind of Galenic heroic measures, being purged, and that didn't work. So he just, at the end of his life, he just really suffered. He just suffered and prayed, and that's how he ended his life. But I mean, people looked for options. They looked for ways to manage their health. They weren't helpless in the face of it. They actively looked for remedies. They talked to friends. They read books. They took notes. Women had collections of remedies in the home. So it wasn't a passive experience, but they couldn't possibly know what we know. You know, there were microscopes in London, but you wouldn't know what to look for. And you wouldn't have a microscope in Essex anyway, probably. You would have a microscope if you were a member of the Royal Society, but then you wouldn't know to look for parasites or, you know. So there was a limited amount that they could do. So yes, an infection could turn into sepsis very easily.
With that. So do people think that Jocelyn was a hypochondriac? Was he a courageous man? What do people think? Those of you who are here, what's the votes? Courageous? Is there courage in compromising when you're compromising to keep your flock alive? That was something that was occurring to me during the presentation as Frank was talking. Is it more courageous to, I'll use a biased word, to flee to the new world where you think you can control, you can set up the perfect society under your control, or to stay when the plague and the armies are fighting near you and the plague is getting closer and closer? What's people's thoughts on courage?
If I may, I'm going to say I don't think he was a hypochondriac, especially I know Sarah put in some estimates about chronic disease. I think there was a lot to worry about back then. I think it's very interesting to see. I think we often think about anxiety and worry as a modern phenomenon, and it's very interesting to see that from a perspective, a very human perspective in the past, and someone who might be rightfully concerned about the various risks of the world. And one of the things, like, there was a lot of stuff that if it happens to us now, you know, we know exactly who to go to get it fixed. Being Americans might be expensive, but like, we have options. Whereas it's, how scary is it to be in a place where things can just happen and you have absolutely no understanding of why they're happening, and like, you don't have any options, but you know it's a very real possibility that, like, you know, something could just happen and you are now sick, and you are now chronically sick, and you don't have modern medicine, and you don't have a public social safety net. And I would definitely in his place be concerned about a lot of this stuff happening to me or the people I care about.
In our lives today, we presume that there's an antibiotic or a pill to cure us, or surgery if necessary. We presume that your children will outlive you. People are shocked and horrified and say it's unnatural today to have a child die before the parent.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, was that the assumption that children should outlive their parents in the 17th century?
No. I mean, I think there is an idea, though, that, you know, as people might even say today, that in the developing world, people don't care if their children die. That's not true. You can see that in Jocelyn's discussion later when his daughter Mary does die. And but you just expect a lot of death, not necessarily of your children, although they will die. You just expect a lot of death. Your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, your in-laws, it just runs through. And think about having 30 people in your family die in the course of your lifetime. That's a lot of people. And you see that even through the 19th century, through large part of the 19th century. Although, Sid, you could probably speak to that a little more in a more knowledgeable way as a doctor. you know, when
I was going to ask a question of both you and Frank, but I'll get to the medical part in a second. As I read Jocelyn's diary, and I didn't read the whole thing, several things jumped out. One, constant prayer to avoid sin, constantly talking about public humiliation, and also trying to avoid gross sins. For somebody who is not as knowledgeable about the 16th century or 17th century, what was he talking about? What is public humiliation? What's he talking about with gross sins? That seemed to be his greatest fear. Then, of course, he was worried about all the injuries that people got associated with horses. And then finally himself, his ulcer on his leg, maybe heart failure at the end, maybe renal kidney failure, because he talks about dark urine. So we don't know what he was talking about. I had not seen a picture of Jocelyn until you showed it. He has a double chin, is he obese? Is that a big diabetic ulcer that he was dealing with? Or did he have diabetes, which wasn't known at that time? So there are lots of questions. As we read and as we see pictures, we begin to learn a lot more.
Nice point about the pictures.
So what about the public humiliation? What about the gross sins? What is Jocelyn talking about?
I'm going to let Frank answer that. You're more knowledgeable.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Gee whiz.
Yeah.
I will be honest, I have not, while I've read the entire thing years ago, I have not looked at the excerpts carefully that Sarah so nicely sent out to us. So I'm not sure exactly if I'm speaking to the point here. There are a lot of things that, as far as sins, that any Puritan would likely be concerned with. Some of them, of course, were whether or not some of their activities within the church were sinful in the eyes of God. And you know, could you read from the book, use the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer, or was this indifferent, or was this sinful? There are personal thoughts that some people had. I mentioned Wallington's diary before. I mean, Wallington expresses lust of the spirit, which I don't know that Jocelyn had, but certainly controlling improper sexual impulses or thoughts was something that some people would consider. Fairness in dealing with others, putting your own self-interest ahead of that of others, is something that could be a sin. And as a clergyman, he might be called out on some of these things. So, I mean, there's any failings that become public would certainly be humiliating to a clergyman. It's probably not the greatest of answers, but while I have my box open here, I do want to make a point to go to, you know, Roxanne asked the question about, you know, people fleeing and abandoning their congregations, which itself would be considered a sin by some and maybe a necessity by others. But there's something that we haven't touched upon that I think is very important, probably, to understand Jocelyn as a whole. And that is, he was a very successful farmer.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't a whole lot of clergy who have an external source of income, such as a farm. We look at New England, we don't find any of them who are substantially becoming wealthy as a result of activities other than their congregational responsibilities. In Jocelyn's case, that would also have made, in one respect, leaving more difficult, but on the other hand, particularly after 1662, if he had been deprived of his living, he didn't need it financially. Mm-hmm. He would have had his farm to support himself. And I've been trying to think, as we've been going through this, of any other clergy that I can think of that, you know, Puritan clergy, I would say, who would have had you know, that sort of farm income, that sort of private estate that would supplement their clerical living.
Yeah, very, very good point. Sarah, as we wrap up, yep.
Can I just say, so
Yep.
I don't know, Frank will know more than I, but there's no hint in Jocelyn of wanting to go to the New World or any hint of abandoning his flock. He is loyal to them. He goes through a period of doubting himself terribly. He feels his heart is cold. I mean, it is really heartbreaking to read, but he never gives up on them. And I do remember reading John Milton being very sniffy about people leaving to go to the New World. You know, this was really a betrayal of the cause. So I wonder how much among Puritan clergy in Essex, of whom there were hundreds and hundreds, that there was that feeling, you know.
And that's what diaries do. They reveal the inner and outer life, the conflicts. Sarah, the final question that you were asking us, what kind of man do we think Jocelyn was? Let me turn it around and ask you in closing, what kind of man do you think Ralph Josselin was?
Well, he's so human. He's so very human. He doesn't confide all his innermost fears until well into the diary, but he uses this diary as a way of working, documenting his fears, facing them. I mean, that takes a lot. Writing down that you have doubts about your faith, that takes courage, I think. So I feel he's a really human person. He's obviously gifted in a scholarly sense, because the sermon, if anybody's interested, I can send you the sermon. The sermon is beautiful, and he demonstrates a compassion and understanding of people and how they experience grief that goes beyond the ordinary, and it's phrased in this beautiful way that shows the rhetorical training he would have had at Cambridge and in his education from his father. So what else? I do think he had courage, because I think even though he doesn't talk about I'm being brave, he lives in a very anxious time. And even though, yes, he compromises on the Book of Common Prayer, and he writes that down, that he did it, he documents it. And then, but still in 1669, he's being called into court for not wearing the surplice and sort of clerical garb. So yes, I do think he was brave.
Yeah.
And I do think he suffered because of ill health, although I do think he's a little bit on the, if not a hypochondriac, on the far end of the bell-shaped curve in terms of being worried about health.
Yeah.
That's my final word.
That's love. That's great. Thank you very much. Let's give a big unmuted round of applause or claps or fun little things, icons to Sarah. Thank you so much, Sarah.
And Frank. Sorry, and Frank.
And Frank. But yeah. Sarah first, and then Frank, very much. Thank you very much for sharing your deep knowledge of the Puritan world with us. This was great. Let me take you to our next event, which is, this is the Partnership of Historic Bostons. This is our marvelous new website. Pardon me while I brag about the website. Sarah and I and James and John Morrison, our chair, and Sid and others, we spent a lot of time working on this website. We just have seen a 17th century life. There's that great picture that Sarah got of the Earls Colne church where Ralph Josselin preached and served. And coming up above the screen, coming into the screen is Above Her Sex. Our next reading and discussion event is Wednesday, June 6th. From 7 to 8:30, same time, same place. Yves Laplante, noted historian, will be looking at public women who have always been a problem, at least to men, in the 17th century and now. So she'll be discussing women such as Anne Hutchinson, that Yves is a specialist on, who's a prominent early Boston settler whom we were mentioning briefly. We'd love you to register for this. This is indeed the registration link that I will put in a moment into the chat. If James hasn't already put it there, you can register through here. And the readings, is that under, where are the readings? Those are under?
Under discuss.
Under discuss.
Your 17th century.
There we go. So to find the readings, because people are asking on the readings, go to your 17th century, drop-down menu, discuss. And here's our fellow who was the opening slide. At the bottom of it, do you see here at the bottom is readings? Click on this and it will actually take you, oh, because I'm already logged into it. When you click on it, it will take you to a password page. James has already put in that the password is read now. I had it up because I was looking at the readings again this afternoon. And there you can see the readings for Ralph Josselin, readings for our prior one, The Land is a Living Witness, readings for my event of last April. So this is our part of our lovely website. We want you to come and visit it. We want you to come and visit it. We'd love you to volunteer with the partnership. If you recognize similarities in Ralph Josselin's life and diary and anxieties and the age with today, if it resonated with you, we'd love you to donate if possible, because we want to do more. We're hoping to get back into doing walking tours around Boston, Massachusetts. We have a great fall series coming up. And also even before the fall, Frank, you just agreed today that you would do a discussion on the Winthrop Memorial that has been taken down here in Boston and looking at monuments and memorials. Actually, Sarah, you and Ralph were working, Ralph's and Frank's are confusing me. You and Frank were working on this. Can you say a brief word on the monuments and memorials series?
So given that monuments are being discussed across the country, indeed across the world, and along with that, a look at how the story of history is told. So whose history is memorialized? How are they memorialized? What was the purpose of the statues or monuments that have been erected? And then who is left out of that equation? So we're looking for people to do, and we have Frank to set it off, a series of 3. One would be on the Winthrop Statue, which is in front of First Church on Marlborough Street, which is actually really very beautiful. So that would be one. And then we'd like to look at the Founders Memorial and how that portrays the kind of is supposed to be the encounter, the first footsteps from the Winthrop fleet onto the Shawmut Peninsula. Native Americans are present, although obviously dressed in Plains Indians outfits. And I'm meeting somebody who looks alarmingly like the then mayor
Of Boston, Mayor Curley.
supposed to be William Blackstone. So there's that. And then there's the idea of missing monuments. So who is not being memorialized here? What about the people who lived around and used the Shawmut Peninsula as for fishing or agriculture or whatever else? Like, why do we have no physical reminder of them, or indeed of early Black Bostonians, because they arrived in 1638.
Yeah.
So that's the theme.
You can see that at the Partnership for Historic Boston's, where we've been wrestling with a lot of contemporary events. By no means is the 17th century dead. It's living today. We are a living history organization. We'd love your participation, your involvement. Come to more of the events. Join us in the 17th century today. And with that, why don't we wrap up the formal reading discussion of this evening. Thanks, Sarah, once more, and Frank, and everyone here. Thank you for participating and contributing your thoughts and thinking your ideas. So thank you very much, Sarah, Frank, and everybody.
Okay.
This wraps up the formal one. We'll hang around for a few more minutes. Anybody who wants to hang around is welcome to unmute and chat.
Okay, thank you.
This was great. Thank you, Sarah.